2019 CFL Draft was projected to be dominated by the linemen again as usual, at least in the first round. But last year, we saw the Hamilton Tiger Cats go with wide receiver Mark Chapman with the first overall selection. So would there be a surprise this year by the Toronto Argonauts? Let's check out this year's CFL Draft. And because the Canadian League is a smaller league, we will be covering the second round of the draft as well. So with the first overall selection in the 2019 CFL Draft, the Toronto Argonauts select Shane Richards, offensive line from Oklahoma State. The second overall selection was forfeited by the Montreal Alouettes after they selected Tyler Johnston, offensive line, in the 2018 supplemental draft. So with the second overall pick, the Hamilton Tiger Cats select Jesse Gibbon, offensive line, out of Waterloo. And pick number 3 would go to Edmonton. So with the third overall pick, the Edmonton Eskimos select Matthew Betts, defensive line, out of Laval. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers have the fourth pick from a trade with the BC Lions just before last year's draft, along with the 2018 second round pick for 2018 first and second round draft picks. And with this fourth overall pick, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers select Drew Desjardins, offensive line, out of Windsor. Winnipeg also have the fifth pick, which is their natural selection. So with pick number 5, they select Jonathan Kongbo, defensive line, out of Tennessee. With the sixth pick, the Saskatchewan Roughriders selected our first wide receiver, Justin McInnes from Arkansas State. Pick number 7 goes to the East Division champions and Grey Cup finalists Ottawa Redblacks, and they drafted Alex Fontana, offensive line, out of Kansas. And last but certainly not the least for round number 1, the defending Grey Cup champions Calgary Stampeders, and their first round selection is Hergy Mayala, wide receiver, out of Connecticut. So we start the second round with the 9th overall pick, and the Toronto Argonauts select Robbie Smith, defensive line, out of Wilfrid Laurier. The Hamilton Tiger Cats own the 10th pick from a trade with the Montreal Alouettes just before last year's draft, along with last year's first overall selection and 2018 4th and 6th round picks, in exchange for last year's second overall selection and 4th and 7th rounders, as well as offensive lineman Ryan Bombin and wide receiver Jamal Robinson. And so the Hamilton Tiger Cats would pick Nikola Kalinic, wide receiver, out of York, at number 10. Then the 11th pick is Hamilton's natural selection, and they go with another wide receiver, David Ungerer, out of Idaho. At pick number 12, the Edmonton Eskimos drafted Kyle Saxelid, offensive line, out of UNLV. The Montreal Alouettes acquired the 13th pick from the BC Lions last year for running back Terrell Sutton and a third-round pick in this year's draft. And they would pick with the 13th selection Keon Julian Grant, wide receiver from St. Francis Xavier. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers would pick our first running back of the draft with the 14th pick, Brady Oliveira, out of North Dakota. The Saskatchewan Roughriders select with pick 15, Braden Lenius, wide receiver, out of New Mexico. The Montreal Alouettes also got pick number 16 last year prior to the trade deadline from the Ottawa Redblacks in exchange for linebacker Chris Aki, and so they would pick Nate Anderson, defensive line, out of Missouri. Finally, back to the Calgary Stampeders at number 17, and they choose Vincent Desjardins, defensive line, out of Laval. And the last two picks of the second round here are territorial draft picks, which are used to select players born within the team's territorial limits, and those teams are the Toronto Argonauts and the Hamilton Tiger Cats, being the teams with the highest waiver priority. So that would allow the Toronto Argonauts to choose Matthew Boateng out of Fresno State with the 18th pick, in our first defensive back of the draft. And the Montreal Alouettes go with Samuel Thomasin, offensive line, out of Laval, to wrap up round number 2. So the linemen did dominate the first round of the CFL Draft once again, but don't count out the wide receivers as they had their number in the first 2 rounds as well. And I hope your teams did well in this year's draft. Can't wait to get this season started after the crazy off season. So thanks so much for watching, please like and subscribe, and I hope you'll tune in to the next episode.